Services. Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about Android services. So services are one of the basic features in Android. So when you develop an Android application, services play an important role. So because of this, you should learn services back and front and forward. Well, you got to know them real well anyway. We're going to talk about services in pretty good detail in this upcoming video. So a service, as I said, is an Android application component that can perform long-running operations in the background. Service is also an Android component like the other Android components, but it works in the background. So another feature of the services of Android is that there is no user interface. So services don't need a user interface because services don't actually interact with users, right? So normally other Android components are in constant interaction with users, mail inputs and password inputs and clicking buttons and all that good stuff. But services don't need that. A service can be started by other Android components. So for example, when you click a button in an Android application, a service can be started in the background by this button, right? So let's say in a real-world example, I can give a file download example as a real-world example. In an application, when you click a download button, a service starts to download the file in the background. Now, sometimes this file can be a huge file size, and it can take a while to download this file. A service takes this download task and does it in the background. Meanwhile, you can go on working within your application, right? So, in this download example, first, the download works in the background. Second, this download service does not have a user interface. It can show the user a download bar or a notification, but these are not in the activity or in the application. Third, the service started with a download button, which means that the service component started with another button component. Now we can give another service example. So a music player application can be an example for some services. A music player can continue to play selected music in the background. And another example could be something like an application can download a photo from the internet in the background. Or an application can send information to the server in the background. Of course, you can give millions of examples of services. There are many extensive uses of services in Android applications. But there are 3 different types of services in Android applications. So the first one, I think you probably know, is Foreground Services. So in Foreground Services, the user can see the process. For example, your application will download a file in the background. This is a foreground service. In the foreground service, the user needs to see notifications. Also, the user needs to see the download process, or when the download finishes. There should be some information that's given to the user. Also, even though the user does not interact with the application, the service has to continue to work in the background. For example, your application starts to download a file in the background. This file could be a huge size, let's say a gigabyte, and while the download process continues, the user can continue to work within the application. Even if the user leaves the application, the download process must continue. So the second one is background services. So in the background services, the user does not see the process. The application does not show the notifications to the user. Now, sometimes the user doesn't even know anything about the service process or what's going on. It does everything in the background. Let me think of an example. So you develop an application. This application stores some photos in the device memory. And while the application is storing photos on the device, it can compress the photos in the background. Now, the user doesn't have to know about this compression process. But what the application does in the background, or how the application compresses photos in the background, is circumstantial. The user doesn't know anything about the processes. What the user does, the user just takes the photos and saves them to the device. And while you store these photos in the background, you can create a compression service in the background so that the photos take up less space in the memory to make the application work better on the phone. The user's going to be very happy about that. So in other words, you can compress photos in the background, and when you need these photos, you can uncompress them again. So in these examples, this service, you're doing some operations in the background and without the user's knowledge. Also, the user doesn't interact with this service. Now, the third one is bound services. We talked a little bit, maybe remember that I mentioned it before, but this is the service that is dependent on the component that calls itself. So service interacts with the component permanently that calls itself. So when the component that calls itself stops, the service also stops. The service does not continue to work in the background. And in the literature, this relationship is called client-server relation. So in this relationship, the server is in service and the client is the component that starts the service. A music player application could be an example for bound services, because when you start a music player application, the service sends data to the player periodically. This data could be which music could be playing, or which is the name of the next song, or which minute of music is playing, and this kind of thing. When the user closes the application, the music will stop. Now, when you start the application again, music will also be able to start to play again. So you see that the service is in continuous interaction with a component. And that's why we call this kind of service bound service. Now, when you come up to the service writing part, there are two service classes. The first one is the standard service class. So what is the standard service class? This is a traditional service class. The service class takes on the whole task on its own. But this service class has a feature that uses the main thread of the application. So I'm thinking that I'll give you a few details for this part. So Android operating system gives each application a share of the processor. So that means that your application uses this share of the processor. Also, your service will use the same share of the processor. That makes sense, right? But if the service uses most of this share, your application will slow down. So because of this, if your service has a big task, you should not use this standard service class because it will slow down your application. But if your service task is small, you can go ahead and use standard service class. So for an example, your application will download a movie from the internet, and at the same time, you want to be able to use your application. So the download process will take some time and will use resources of the application. And then when you use the application at the same time, it works slowly. Users do not want a slow application. So how do you solve this problem? So this is where another service class type helps us. It's called intent service class. So the intent service class is a subclass of the service class. The intent service class does not use the application's main thread. It creates an other work thread and uses its own thread. So that means the intent class requests an other share of the processor from Android operating system. This doesn't slow down the application, and the intent service class is used in long-term background processes. So, of course, now that you understand everything there is to know about service, we can shuffle on over to Android Studio. Now, because I don't want to just, give you theoretical information that, might be okay, and you can tell your friends all about it at your next party, but I need to show you this in practice so that you get practice so that you can develop some great Android apps. So, have you got Android Studio open? We have a project in Android Studio, and let's continue with it. Before we start, though, I do want to show you what the finished version looks like in this example. So we've got 2 buttons in this example, and if we click on the Start Service button, it, of course, will start the service. Now, if we click the Stop Service button, it will stop the service. Sounds magical, right? But I do want to track these steps from the log records. So when the service starts, the log records will show us that the service is started, and when the service stops, the log records will also show us that the service has stopped. All right, so now we can start designing the project. And I will add 2 buttons here. I will change the layout width of the buttons to 200 dp. And we'll give some distance between the buttons. And I'll give an ID to these buttons. And now that that's done, I will define these buttons in the main activity. I'll just write in here button, button start, and button, button stop. Now in the onCreate method, button start equals find view by ID r.id.button start, and button stop equals find view by ID r.id.button stop. Okay, so once that's done, I will add click listeners to these buttons. Now you know how I will add a click listener. You are very well practiced in that by now, so that's all standard. So now that that's done, we need a service class to run services. So I'm going to create a service class from here. First, I'm going to right-click the main activity Java class and select New Java class. And I will need to give a name to this class. Name is Services Example. All right, so Android Studio created a Service Example class. And the Service Example class needs to extend service class. So I'll just write here, extend service. Now, you know we mentioned 2 service classes, right? Standard service class and intent service class. So first, we will extend standard service class. And when I extend service class, Android Studio wants to add methods. So let me just have a look and select from here, Implement Methods. And it will add this method. Now you see that Android Studio added onBind method. You remember that we mentioned the bound service before? We're not going to create a bound service. Because of this, we're not going to use that, but it does have to stay here. So I'm going to add other methods. First, the onCreate method. Second, onStartCommand method. And then the onDestroy method. And now we'll write service codes in these methods. And we will write the onCreate method, operations that should be done when the service is first created. And we will write in the onStartCommand method the operations that should be done when that service is started. And we will write in the onDestroy method the operations that should be done when that service is stopped. So what you want the service to do, you will write in each of these sections. For example, if you want to download a picture from the internet, you will write these codes in this class. So we're not going to write a service in this video for now. I just, want to check whether the system is working or not. So let's check that when I create a service, I need to see whether this onCreate method is working or not. Now, to see if these methods work, I will need to add log records into these methods. First, I will add in the onCreate method. And of course, you remember from the previous videos how we will add log records, right? The log records have two parameters. The first one is title, and I will write service for the title. And the second one is message. And what will I write for the message? Service is created. And I'll write the same code in the onStartCommand method. I'll just change the message. I will write service is started. And in the onDestroy method, I will write service is stopped. So how do I run this service? So we have a service class. We also have a main activity class. Hopefully you remember that when we explained services, we also said that a component should start the service. So in this example, our component is button. Now, while we're on the subject of buttons, let's go ahead and change the text of the buttons. And what will I write for the first button? Start service. And what about for the second button? Stop service. Okay, so if you want, you can write something here, start download instead of start service. The time that it will start the download process, or I don't know, something. But of course, you will need to write the download process codes in the service class. So now when we click the Start Service button, the service will start in the Click Listener. And then after that, the service class will start to run operations. Now we do need one more thing at this point. We'll need to define the service class in the manifest file. So let's open up the manifest file. And in here, under Activity, XML code, I will write service XML code. And in this part, I just need to write service class name. You remember what the name of the service class name is? Service example. All right. Now after that, we just need to write code to run the service. So what I'll do is I'll write these codes in the onClick method, and I will start this service using the intent method. So I just write that in here, intent I equals new intent. And the intent method has two parameters. And the first one is get application context. The second one is serviceexample.class. On the second line, I will write start service I. And this start service command will start the service. So I promised you, and I will, explain this intent topic in the next video. But now that we've done all that, I will open the log records. And in the log records, I will select debug records. And in the search area, I will write service. Okay, so now I can run the application. And the application's working. So when I click the Start Service button, in the log records, the service is created, the service is started. So first, service is created. After that, the service is started. Okay, so now the service is running. After the service started, if I click Start Service button again, you can see here that this time it just writes service is started. Because when you first created the service, after that, it won't create again until you stop the service, right? So it will just start again, created service. Now also, I need to mention to you that if I write here the stop self method, it will stop the service automatically after the service finishes the task. So for example, if your service task is to download a file from the internet, the service will stop automatically after it finishes downloading. So let's run it again and see how this method works. So you can see here that when I click the Start Service button in the log records, the service is created, service is started, and service is stopped. And I've not stopped the service yet, but it stopped automatically. That is the stop self method. And if I wanted to stop the service manually, I will write my code in the Stop Service button. I'll write it here, the same intent method, and on the second line, I will write Stop Service I. So now when I click the Stop Service button, the Stop Service method will work. And in the service class, onDestroy method will also work. In the onDestroy method, this log record will work. So let's run it again. And the application is working. So first I will start the service, but I need to delete the stop self method. Now, when I click the Start Service button, it writes service is created and service is started. When I click the Stop Service button, it writes service is stopped. So this example is classic service class. Also, you should remember that there is another service class. It's the intent service. Classic service class uses the main thread. Intent service class creates its own thread. And I think we'll leave it there. So this time I will extend the intent service class. So when I write here extends intent service, I can delete this onBind method, and the other methods will stay. So I'm going to click here and select Implement Methods. It will add onHandle intent method. Now also, I will need to create a constructor for this class. I'll click here and select Create Constructor, and I create a constructor with argument. So I'll delete the argument, and I'll just write it here, return name. Now the intent service is ready. And I'll delete this part, it's not necessary. I can see methods in these log records. And I'll just add a log record in this onHandleIntent method. Okay, so everything's ready. And yeah, we're ready to run the application again. So when I click the Start Service button in the log records, service is created, service is started, onHandleIntent method worked, and the service is stopped. And look at that. I did not even write stop self method. It stopped the service itself because the intent service handles everything itself. When it finishes the task, it stops the service itself. So that's about it for services in Android applications. I really do hope that was useful for you. And you can take it and run it and mash it up and create some wonderful services and applications of your own. I'll see you next time.